but I also want to bring in nation states, the progress of nations. This is something you've explored in your book, Against Happiness, which you co-authored with Joseph Ledoux, who's also been on the show. And another guest who's been on the show, Jeffrey Sachs, is probably on the other end.
That's right.
He's a critic of economic policy, and he says that often GDP doesn't account for the well-being of citizens or the happiness or the quality of life. And as a result, countries need to implement some form of a happiness metric. So Bhutan did this. They implemented the gross national happiness. And they said this is as equal or maybe even more equal than the gross domestic product. But now this opens up a new can of worms because Bhutan describes happiness as a collective state, as a communal state. No one person can be happy if the entire community is miserable. Whereas the American view might be slightly more individualistic. So is it even the right approach to implement happiness metrics when it comes to economic policy for a nation? And will we ever have a universal consensus of what's happiness?
Good. Yeah, I love this topic. Yeah, so I'm a fan of, I use that word that comes from Aristotle. Aristotle, just to start with the first part of your thread, and then we'll get right to these universal metrics for happiness or well-being. So you're totally right. I mean, again, just like with the, say, Jeannie Tsai work on children's books and which kind of picture of happiness is modeled, different models. So too, Aristotle says a human life, a life of eudaimonia, eu meaning good, daimon meaning spirit, a life of good spiritedness. When I was in graduate school in the early 1970s, all of a sudden, we used to translate that word in Aristotle, eudaimonia, Greek word, as happiness. But then a professor at Princeton named John Cooper all of a sudden announced to the world, that's naughty, don't do that anymore, use the word flourishing. Which is interesting because it was already, what Cooper was seeing was that there's a kind of the couple in Annie Hall concept of happiness. And that was maybe helping people misinterpret what Aristotle was up to. So Aristotle is very clear that, a good human life, a life of eudaimonia, is an active life of developing your talents, your interests, your capacities, your abilities, and your virtue. So becoming a morally, and we might say, well-rounded person. And it's an active life out there in the world doing that. The Buddhist view of happiness, some people say that even though the Dalai Lama, for example, wrote a book with Howard Cutler called The Art of Happiness, I think it was called, that traditional Buddhism actually doesn't promise happiness at all. It thinks of happiness as an illusion. What it promises is mitigation of suffering, which is a different thing. So there's been even controversy inside Buddhist circles about that. But insofar as Buddhism does have a concept of sort of positive well-being, of something in the vicinity of happiness, it does look somewhat different both psychologically and practically from the active Aristotelian life. So again, you see the cultural differences. So with respect to your excellent question about the project, so what happened, the history here is kind of interesting, like how Joe Ledoux and I, and Batya Mesquita and the other authors developed this against happiness sort of motto. Not that we're against happiness truly, but we were worried about the following. So let me give a little background here that might be helpful. So I'm good friends with Jeff Sachs, and Jeff Sachs had invited me in to be part of meetings at the Vatican. The first set of meetings over a 3-year period were every 3 months over a 3-year period were on the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, which do focus on well-being. In other words, they're focused, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations are things like equal education for all the boys and the girls of the earth through high school, gender justice, peace, climate justice, for example. So things that would be conducive to overall well-being of a population. After we finished that project among sort of religious leaders and secular people like myself, we started up a new project on, I think we called it Science, Ethics, and Well-Being. And it was, again, religious leaders from across the world and a lot of the principles in the World Happiness Report, which Jeff has been one of the leaders for years. And as you say, the World Happiness Report has been measuring happiness, what they call happiness. Maybe they're in the 10th or 12th report by now, I think. And I was at the first meeting where the the ministers from Bhutan were at Columbia University. And as you say, what happened there was that Bhutan, the tiny little country of Bhutan, surrounded by China and India, some people were criticizing Bhutan for having a low gross domestic product. And the king at the time said, well, gross domestic happiness is more important than money. And at the same time, some economists were making the discovery that once you made above, we'll say it's probably now about $100,000 American for a family of four, then more money gets you more things, but it doesn't increase by most measures of happiness, your happiness.
This is the Easterlin Paradox.
The Easterlin Paradox, it's called. Now, what's interesting about that is that was treated very much as a discovery in economics. But what's funny about it is if you look at every great world spiritual and philosophical tradition, the theme that money doesn't bring happiness is there from the very beginning. So it interests me as a scholar always to see how sometimes people need some contemporary social scientists to discover something which has been known for a long time. But in any case, that led then to an industry of many, many different measures of happiness. And the main measure of happiness that's used in the World Happiness Report, the main measure, it's not the only measure, is a measure which asks people, how satisfied are your life? How satisfied are you with the life you're living on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 to 11, with the worst life being sort of complete dystopia and the best life being complete utopia? And then what you do is you gather the populational results from that, and then countries are ranked. And so what you reliably do find is that Scandinavian countries have the highest. I think Finland has been up there number one for the last 3 or 4. You'll find places like the United States around the 20s. Dubai has been trying to be the happiest city in the world. And I was in some consultations with people from Dubai about this. The criticism that me and my colleagues had was not necessarily with doing this kind of social scientific measure. You're not going to stop these things. But it was trying to call attention to some of the concerns about these measures, because within the community which studies happiness and well-being, there are controversies. So here's a couple of the controversies. One is that we know, just take America, if you go to some of the poorest cities in America, certain parts, East St. Louis, Missouri, for example, or certain parts of Atlanta, Georgia, that are the poorest Black communities, you find reliably there that the single Black men, most of whom have lost their wives and their families, will reliably give measures to their life that are 7 or above. That's about what Finland scales are. So you'll get peculiar results in those cases. And if you ask those people where they think, those men who are poor and living miserable lives typically, where they think they'll be in a few years, they think they'll be 10. And no one says that in the world. So you have these odd kind of cohort effects, which are where people just seem to say sort of odd things. We also know that, for example, in order to rank Japan, we'll just take Japan, you have to add a point to Japan and deduct a point from Americans. Exaggerate, Japanese underestimate.
Understated, yeah.
So that's one thing. But those are two things. A third problem that we're very interested in is that the report itself isn't attentive enough to is the Gini coefficient, as you know, in economics measures inequality in a country. And the World Happiness Report in studying objective well-being can sometimes mask that. And here's what I have in mind. If there's a country in which 30% of the people are super duper rich and 70% are super duper poor, the average might be actually relatively high. It might look relatively good, but it could really be bimodal. And most theories of justice say, don't look at the average of the happiness, look at things like the Gini coefficient and look at the worst off. So sometimes we think that these happiness measures can mask inequalities that are important to look at. The third question is this. Aristotle is almost always, third criticism, Aristotle is almost always mentioned as in favor of doing something like the World Happiness Report. The authors always say, Aristotle would love this. Aristotle believes that eudaimonia is measured by a person's satisfaction with her own life. But actually, Aristotle is quite explicit that he thinks that that's not the way to measure it. It's actually an objective matter whether a person has satisfied or achieved her potential, either moral or otherwise. So the fact that a person is satisfied with her life, unless they've actually achieved their potential objectively, now how we measure that is complicated, or become a morally excellent person, that's what whether they're flourishing depends on. And it's not a subjective judgment for Aristotle. So we don't have, and there are some tests out there that measure these different things. So basically our critique is of the World Happiness Report and measures like that only look at subjective happiness. And a lot of the happiness industry in general, for example, I have been at various business schools talking. They always have programs about happiness and leadership and things like that, like Arthur Brooks at Harvard has one. And they focus on the sort of serenity and well-being of particular individuals, doing yoga and breathing and mindfulness exercise. It's kind of just sort of psychological hygiene for people who already admire their own selves and their own lives. And I think there's something, sort of peculiar about it. And that takes me back finally to what you said about Bhutan, because, Bhutan, the leaders of Bhutan have said, no one is happy unless everyone is happy. Well, that just should mean that regularly Bhutanese should say, well, I'm not happy yet.
Right.
And there's something to be said for that conception, because surely if happiness is a good thing, then we should want everybody to have it.